Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Sounds like Jesus is setting this high, unattainable platform upon which we are supposed to stand. Be perfect, he says. What does that mean? He's obviously reaching back and relating to his disciples what we hear Moses relating to his people. To be holy as your God is holy. And so when Jesus speaks about being perfect, he's not talking about being obsessive-compulsive. He's not talking about perfectionism. He's not talking about P's and Q's all in their place, and I's and T's dotted and crossed. He's talking about holiness. Be holy as your Father in heaven is holy. And I think to understand that, we just have to look back a few lines in today's gospel. Well, how is God holy? And Jesus gives an example. He allows the sun to come up and shine on the good and the bad. He allows his rain to fall upon the heads of the just and the unjust. That God's mercy is for all. His love is for all, whether we deserve it or not. Whether we deserve his love, whether we merit his love, God gives it freely. That's holiness. The opening up of self, the pouring out of self. I think it's in St. Luke's Gospel where we hear this story recounted, and instead, rather than saying, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, St. Luke puts on Jesus' lips, be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. And that begins to open our eyes to a deeper understanding of what it means to be perfect, what it means to be holy. And for sure, it's not easy. It's not easy to do what Jesus says, to love your enemies, to pray for those who persecute you, to do good to those who don't do good to you. The human instinct is what the old law recounted, the law of retribution. The human instinct is to fight back. If you take an eye, I take an eye. If you knock out a tooth, I knock out a tooth. Whatever you give, I give back. And there is that sense of justice where we pay evil for evil. That somehow that's going to bring a balance. The continuation of evil acts. But that doesn't balance anything. In order to balance out a negative, you don't add another negative to it. You add a positive to it. And it cancels it out. And so Jesus tells his disciples, challenges his disciples to do good in the face of evil. Even when it is difficult. Now think back to Moses, who's speaking to his people about being holy. We know his own struggles with that. Moses was leading his people through the desert. And you remember as they were walking through the desert, they'd been there for weeks and months and maybe even years by this point, and they started to complain and to gripe and to moan about the heat and the sand and having no food and having no water and how difficult everything was, and why did you bring us out here to die? And where is this God of ours? And are we ever going to get there? Why don't we just turn around and go back, and so on and so forth? And Moses is getting angry with this people. He just wants to lash out at them. And they're complaining because they're thirsty. They want something to drink. And so God tells Moses, give them water. Strike the rock, and water will pour out of the side of the rock, and give my people what they are thirsting for. And Moses just can't do that in love. He does it in anger. He turns around to those people and he says, oh, you Israelites, I can't stand you. How long must I do this? Do you want water to drink? Do you think God can do this? I'll prove it to you. And he smashes his staff against the rock. And God keeps his promise, and water flows out to satisfy that people. But God then reveals to Moses his disappointment. You didn't demonstrate my holiness to this people. Rather, you demonstrated anger and hatred. You can't lead them into the promised land. You will die before you enter into the promised land yourself. And someone else is going to lead them in. Someone else is going to show them my holiness. Now, we can't blame Moses in some sense. I mean, here is this people. They didn't deserve that water. They probably led Moses to be all frustrated and angry and upset with them. But at the same time, can we blame the people? Wandering in the desert, not knowing where they were going, seeing some of their compatriots fall down and die, not having food, not having water, not having comforts, not seeing anything. And they complained in ignorance. And Moses, rather than having mercy on that, displayed his anger. Jesus invites us to demonstrate holiness. The people we encounter in our daily lives probably don't always deserve our goodness. Some certainly have hurt us. Some certainly have made life more difficult for us. Our patience gets worn down. Our desire to be in a relationship isn't always there. And we want to strike back. We want to give a tooth for a, or take a tooth for a tooth and an eye for an eye. And yet Jesus reminds us, be perfect. Be holy in those situations. Demonstrate my holiness. The author to the letter of the Hebrews, somewhere in there, tells us that Jesus himself was perfected in what he suffered. That it was in his sufferings, not in his getting even, that he found perfection, but in his sufferings. He allowed those things to happen to him. His people rejected him. His people didn't know what he was doing. His people hated him. And on the cross, when they struck his side, the fires of hell could have burst out and consumed them all. But water poured out. He gave his people what they needed. He satisfied them with his own blood and poured out his mercy upon them. That is our model. To embrace the difficulties and the sufferings and all of those people and situations that aren't perfect. We have no idea the baggage that each of us carries. We have no idea what we have gone through, why we act the way we do sometimes, why we don't seem to change sometimes, why we are where we are. We have no idea. And so rather than lashing out, we are called to lash out with mercy, with holiness. I'm reminded the funeral of a friend of mine whom I went to this past Friday. She was a woman who bore many sufferings in her life. Her body was filled with cancer time and again. It would come and go away. And in her final battle, she was struggling with a brain tumor and with brain cancer. And it would take away her sense of balance, and it would fog up her mind, and eventually her vision began to go tunnel, and she couldn't see. She was unable to drive. She was unable to read. She was unable to see. It was difficult to carry a conversation. And yet, nobody can remember her complaining about her sufferings. Nobody can remember her asking, why me? Why do I have to bear this? Why can't I be healed? Instead, she was one of the most joyful women that I have known. And I remember hearing from the lady who would drive her to her chemotherapy that Patricia would be in the car and she would pray, but she wouldn't pray for herself. She prayed that she would be sitting next to whoever needed to listen to her or whoever needed her to listen to them during that session of treatment. She was always praying for others and offering her weaknesses for others. I think she was a saint. I know she was a saint. Be perfect. We learn perfection in our sufferings. We learn holiness in our weakness and difficulties. That's what softens us. As Jesus says, be perfect today. He is not setting an unreachable goal. He is calling us simply to love and to be merciful. And if we don't have the strength to let His Spirit flow through us in those moments. So feed from His body and drink the blood and water that flow from His side, because He knows His people go through a lot. He doesn't say, darn you, but rather He says, come to me, and I will feed you, and I will give you drink, and my mercy will pour upon you. So be perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect, which means be holy, be merciful, as God is holy and merciful.